Final Fantasy VII Rebirth has been out for a few weeks now, and I've been having such a blast just going through everything, trying my hand at all the crazy-ass mini-games, hunting down world intel for Chadley, and of course progressing my way through the expanded story, which so far has done a really good job at introducing the new party members, and has even introduced some of the big story elements from Crisis Core. No, I'm not talking about Genesis. Well, I mean, he might show up, but I'm about 40 hours in so far, and I've been trying to do like everything I can. So story-wise, I've just made it to the Gold Saucer for the first time, and man, this game has been so f***ing good so far. But as I've been playing, I can't help but notice how different of an experience Rebirth has been from Final Fantasy XVI. I really gotta wonder, seeing as most of my personal gripes with 16 are not really present at all in Rebirth, were these intentional decisions made to set the game so apart? Now, obviously, both of these games were being developed at a similar time, so the differences aren't really related to the audience's reception of 16. But let's take a look at some of my biggest issues with Final Fantasy 16 and see how they stack up compared to Final Fantasy VII Rebirth. So right out of the gates, these two titles have a very different tone. With Final Fantasy 16, we've got this kind of gritty, very dark world that starts out heavy on the Game of Thrones side of things and eventually opens up to a somewhat familiar story centered around crystals and icons. The story is more mature, more violent, and dark through and through. Valisthea is a world filled with slavery, war, and a whole lot of violence. There's very little humor to be found in this game, and although Cid is a wonderful character who brings so much presence to the screen, by the game's own design, he's not going to be around all that much, seeing as this is a game that focuses primarily on Clive's story. With Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, we've got a much more lighthearted romp through the world of Gaia, and a faithful recreation of the world from its PlayStation 1 origins. Cloud and his ragtag group chase after Sephiroth, and yeah, so far there's been a lot of serious moments, but the journey across these cities and towns is where the game's not afraid to get silly. Sometimes maybe a little bit too silly, but that might depend on your personal preference. Now keep in mind, this part of the overall Final Fantasy VII story is known for being a little more adventurous, much more in line with a typical JRPG story compared to the closed-off and very story-focused segments at Midgar. Similarly to 16, Rebirth is Cloud's story, but unlike the former, every party member, and even a lot of these side characters, are given the spotlight, and pretty often. The game's not afraid to remove Cloud from the equation and set the focus on Tifa, or on Yuffie, or on Barrett. Everyone gets their time to shine in the story, and their characterization has been honestly stunning. I can't believe how perfectly they brought these characters to the modern age. Again, I've not beaten Rebirth yet, but so far I really think they're nailing the tone in this one. From the gameplay side of things, 7 and Rebirth again couldn't really be much more different. On the side of exploration, with 16 you've got this world map that teleports you to different areas around the world. Some of these sections are surprisingly small and straightforward, but a few of the areas can be quite expansive and explorable. None of these areas are organically connected, however, and the reliance on fast travel to go to any new area can feel a little lacking if you're really big on the exploration side of things. This definitely streamlines the exploration though, so this instead puts more of the focus onto the story, which works well, as the story is for sure got to be the highlight of the game anyway. But when it comes to the extra things to do in this world, yeah, there's really not much going on in that aspect outside of some optional monster hunts. With Rebirth's focus on exploration, I think it's handled a lot better. The world is huge, but not overly big to the point where it takes forever to get anywhere, and interestingly enough, it seems to me that you can largely ignore a lot of the additional content that the open world provides, such as the extra monster fights or the Queen's Blood card game, unlocking towers. If you don't want to do that kind of stuff, you really don't need to. But if you do sink some time into the game's extra activities, you'll usually be rewarded with some nice gear or a strong piece of materia that you wouldn't normally find until much later. Now, from a combat perspective, this is where I've really got to give my praise to Rebirth. I already thought that the remake's hybrid action and ATB system was probably one of Square Enix's best battle systems, and Rebirth keeps it mostly the same, while adding new gameplay elements in the form of synergy skills and synergy attacks, and adding new abilities to the party members' tools to make them all play a little bit better. Managing a party of 3 feels as good as ever, and similarly to the first part, remake, you'll want to be switching party members on the regular to make the most out of your party and make sure that you're getting enough damage and abilities out. There are always many different ways to approach a fight, and every character has a unique gameplay style that really gives the game a lot of variety in combat. 16's full action combat is great, but variety is not a word I can use to describe it. Clive is your only playable party member, which makes sense until you reach a point in the game when you have a literal party following you around. Feels a bit like Square Enix is teasing us with this one. But as for how Clive plays, well, you unlock new iconic abilities as you progress through the story, and each one I'd treat as a little milestone. Try out some new abilities and see what works. The problem with this system, though, is that you'll likely play through some long segments of the game using the same exact strategies for every fight, hitting the same few cooldowns in the same order over and over. The combat is flashy, and it does a great job at making Clive feel like he's a strong character, just getting stronger and stronger, but I just don't feel like it has enough variety to keep it interesting and fresh throughout the whole 70, 80-hour experience. This could have been addressed in a lot of ways. I think the one playable character concept could have worked here, but you've got to give the player multiple ways to approach combat then. Maybe have multiple weapon types, maybe put in some sort of elemental strategies, put in a wider pool of regular attacks and combos or whatever, but in the end, it did feel a little lacking because of this. So let's move on to one thing a lot of people were talking about surrounding these two Final Fantasy games, and that is mini-games. These were a staple of the franchise during the PlayStation 1 era, and many were excited to see them return in such prominence with Rebirth. I'll be the first to admit that I fucking suck at the piano minigame, but for the most part, I do like their inclusion in Rebirth. There's no denying there are a lot of minigames, though. Is it too much? I don't know. We'll have to see how I feel once I've gotten through the whole game. I don't like that a few of them are actually tied into the main storyline, but most of them are kind of tucked off to the side, so if you don't like one, you don't have to play it. Do I regret spending an hour doing crunches with Tifa? Absolutely not. Jules, we could not let this motherfucker win. But with Final Fantasy XVI, there's really just nothing going on in this department, and that's where I feel like they should have included something to break up the gameplay. Imagine going back to the Hideaway and gambling over a card game with Gav. I actually can't help but feel like Queen's Blood would have fit better in the world of Final Fantasy XVI than VII's, but I am happy to see that card games have returned to Final Fantasy. And did you guys know? There's a Final Fantasy TCG. Someone remind Square Enix because sometimes I think they forget. So lastly, I want to quick mention side quests. 16 got quite a bit of attention over its somewhat dry, MMO-feeling side quest system. I think with 16, there's not enough focus on direction in these cutscenes with the side quests. Usually we just get a cross-armed Clive having a long conversation with an NPC, go kill something somewhere, and usually that's about it. But the Final Fantasy series has been struggling in this department for a long time. Even with games like the VII Remake and Crisis Core, the side quests were pretty lackluster. So far with Rebirth, it seems like they finally got it right. No, these aren't quite up to the standard of something like Baldur's Gate or whatever, but I'm just glad to see the optional content heavily involves the game's different party members. It touches on actual lore around the world, and I even had a blast messing around with Kyrie this time around. So far, it's actually been pretty decent, and I do remember reading in interviews that this is an area of the game that they wanted to focus on improving in Rebirth. Anyway, it's been a long time since we've had two huge Final Fantasy games released back-to-back like this, so it makes sense if they made some of these creative decisions around the games on purpose. Maybe they wanted to make sure that these games could still appeal to different audiences, or maybe they just didn't want to put out two similar-feeling games so closely. That said, which did you end up preferring? I like both of them, but I've got to give the edge to Rebirth. The variety of content has kept the experience feeling fresh so far, and man, I'm just so glad that this game knows when it's okay to be funny, because the Final Fantasy VII world, for as cool as it is, it's equal parts ridiculous. And that's not to say that 16 is bad. The silliness of 7 isn't going to be for everyone anyway. Some might like the more mature and kind of dark setting of 16. But hey, if you made it to the end of the video, would you want to hit that like button for me? You could even stick around for more videos about RPGs, gaming, Final Fantasy, Kingdom Hearts, all kinds of stuff like that. So yeah, see ya.